Kia ora, talofa, namaste, haere and welcome to this week's episode of the Nichecast. Happy to be here, happy to be living in Aotearoa, enjoying a whole lot of Aotearoa sport, and it's been an epic week. It's only Thursday, and it's been an epic week of Aotearoa sport. Warm-up kōrero here. What was your favourite thing, Nick, about the Blackcaps test victory over England? Just one thing, just to get the juices flowing.
Favorite thing? I mean, I don't know. You can't go past just the sheer drama of the final wicket, can you? Got it sitting behind me on the video of it. Just that point at which it was like, I tell you, there was a point where I genuinely thought this is going to end in a draw, isn't it? Especially when they started appealing for a wide on the ball before the last wicket. I'm like, is this going to be a draw? No one's going to enjoy that. Not even a draw. I mean, a tie specifically. Draw was the one result it wasn't going to be at that stage of the game. Um, Also assumed when Jimmy Anderson slugged that four through mid wicket. Okay, I guess we're going to lose after all. And then delicate feather off the face of the bat down leg side, and a nice little catch from Tom Blundell and Neil Wagner getting the plaudits and whatnot. Just incredible theatre. And aside from everything else, and there's so much else that we could talk about from that game, but just aside from everything else, the fact that a 5-day test match boiled down to one moment like that was insane. And that is the peak of test cricket, that something like that can happen. Because you get people who don't like cricket, who will say, like, how can you play for 5 days and still not have a winner? Well, you play for 5 days and might still not get a winner because there's a chance that something like this could happen, where Neil Wagner takes a wicket off the for a 1-run victory. It's the peak of the sport, and it's something that has happened. I mean, the 1-run victory thing has happened twice in history, including this one. I think there's been a tied test match or two in history as well. There's also only ever been 4 instances, including this one, of a team winning after following on. The Blackcaps did both of those things in one game. It might be the most unlikely test result in the history of the sport.
Yeah, let alone the whole Blackcaps context that we have been following
And there's a lot
since
of that.
since the World Test Championship final. My favorite thing is the Basin Reserve, and I kind of alluded to
Mm.
this in prior to this test, and it was in relation to the storms and the natural disasters and cyclones that New Zealand's had, and I just thought, like, coming together at the Basin Reserve doesn't get any better. And I wrote about it as a place of worship. Like, it's a sacred space for Kiwi cricket fans and sports fans. And here I am afterwards, just big up in the Basin Reserve. I think we might have talked about in the Patreon podcast, Basin Reserve best music choices. Every day of the test was humming, big crowds. They all love it. They're all engaged. Obviously, Kiwis, we love to let the tourists create the party. And that's what we do. We just let them sing the songs. We let them play the music, and we just have a jolly old time. We're not here to, poo-poo your chants and everything. We'll take part. We'll enjoy it. You get up and you do it, and we'll be there. And the Basin Reserve crowd was massive throughout the whole test. Fantastic pitch at the Basin Reserve.
Yeah, brilliant.
Fantastic atmosphere. One of the best test venues in the world. New Zealand's representative of the best test venues in the world. Like, we're all putting the Basin Reserve up there as our representative in test cricket. So shout out Basin Reserve, and obviously big up everyone involved in that test match. We're going to break it down. We're going to have a big old kōrero about Blackcaps test cricket. We've also got some Breakers chit-chat ahead of their NBL finals against the Sydney Kings. We've got NRL footy is starting up, so we'll have a little kōrero about rugby league. We've got football, the Wellington Phoenix, as well as Flying Kiwis. And we might even squeeze some Halliburton Johnston Shield and Plunkett Shield domestic cricket into our cricketing conversation coming up as well. We are from the Niche Case, the niche-case.com, where we whip up Aotearoa sporting yarn and kōrero. We have a bunch of deep dives on our website at the moment. The weekly Flying Kiwis recap is live. There is a deep dive into Breakers basketball that you can check in with ahead of their finals campaign. I've done a Warriors preview. Did a it was a bit emotional. I felt like I had to come in quick with the Blackcaps test review just to piggyback on the back of that test victory, but it was a bit like processing so many emotions and so many like just the emotions and also just stats and figures and actual things outside of the emotional response. But I don't know.
I remember doing that after the 2019 World Cup final. So
yeah, well, that's
different emotions on those two occasions.
That's a bad emotional journey. Yeah. But that is live. Whole lot of good stuff is live on our website, theniche-case.com. Also got a big dive into the football ferns that has just been published as well. So if you want to learn about
on the way.
Part 2, holy crack-a-moly, we've got a part 1 and part 2. Who would have thunk it that Nico could whip up 2 parts about the football ferns? But that's what we do.
Definitely.
We dive deep into Aotearoa sports for our website, theniche-case.com. Head on over and you'll find we get deep in the mangroves about some of these Kiwi sporting topics, and we also break down things less deep in the mangroves. We just like dip our toe into the estuary waters with some newsy, current eventy bits and bobs for our email newsletter that we send out every Monday and Friday evening via Substack. The nichecase.substack.com is where you'll find just updates on Kiwi sports, check-ins, some stats, some notes, bits and bobs that help us follow Kiwi sport and build our deep dives into Aotearoa sporting topics. Always lots of value found in those email newsletters via Substack, and we'll be sending out one tomorrow evening. So sign up at thenichecase.substack.com and big up the Patreon whānau. Patreon is the best way to support the Niche Case and all our content. At the moment, we've got 2 extra podcasts there every week. I'm doing an NRL podcast on Mondays, recapping the footy, and on Tuesday we are there for our long-standing Patreon podcast, which usually revolves around Blackcaps cricket. Next week, I imagine, will be about Blackcaps cricket as well, because they're playing Test cricket next week as well against Sri Lanka. Yeah, so that's pretty good. And we will be talking our way through all things Blackcaps on that podcast as well. So if you like those topics, check in with those podcasts. Otherwise, Patreon's the best way to support the Niche Case directly, straight up the guts. Patreon.com/L Niche Case, EL Niche Case. Sign up, and there's some extra goodies there for you as well. Mindfulness is what we need to do. It is what needs to be done. Let's enter the portal.
Yeah, the portal's a little empty because I never actually sorted it out. I started doing it and then we went deep in our pre-recording conversations. But I have an idea, and I'm gonna ask you to pick a number between 1 and 350, and I'll give you a Rumi quote. That's R-U-M-I, Rumi, Persian poet, to be specific.
27.
27. 27 gives us a bit of... That's a good one, actually. It says 27 is foresight is choosing carefully between 2 paths.
I like it.
Yeah, some wisdom in that one.
This might be the mindfulness recipe moving forward. When
I don't mind the ideas of, like, sometimes there's a thing where I've just read it through the week and it's like, oh, that's a good one, I'm going to use that. Other times it's, I don't mind the idea of just leave it to the gods, roll a dice or pick a random number and we'll see what I don't know, divine force intervenes and gives it what was served up in that case. That one worked out all right,
Could you repeat it, please?
No, because I put the book down, but I remember what number it was, so I 27. Can find it again. Foresight is choosing carefully between 2 paths.
Beauty. Let's
I guess any
discuss.
choice is picking between two paths, isn't it? And in some way or another, it's like you either do something or you don't, or you think this or you don't. In a way, it's like everything. If you break it down far enough, is a yes or no. And I guess foresight is just being able to do that in advance. Makes sense.
That is what foresight is, correct? You gave
Yeah.
us the explanation of foresight. Thank you. We do have this Blackcaps test to dive into here. It was quite magical, and I actually got this wrong because I said that Lutuda Taylor took his first wicket in that Bangladesh test. I don't think it was his first test wicket, but it did remind me of that instance where the Blackcaps lost to Bangladesh at Bay Oval. So we have this Bay Oval situation lurking in the background where the Blackcaps kind of misread the Bay Oval situation. But in both instances, they have bounced back. And the bounce back against Bangladesh was pure magical because Taylor took a wicket with his last thing of Test cricket ever, which was exceptional. Now we've got this Test victory over England, which the follow on, the ebbs and flows of the Test, how they won, it was all super duper magical at the Basin Reserve. So you've got all the bells and whistles that go with the Basin Reserve, the limo ride up the up Mount Victoria. I'm sure Tommy Blundell probably walked home as well. That's just what he does. Like, it's a fabulous moment of Test cricket. And I wrote a sentence in my debrief where it was like, we all want more Test victories, especially in New Zealand. But sometimes one Test victory is enough. And I think this one Test victory is an example of that, whereas like this one Test victory was enough to spread some good vibes around the Blackcaps and what has been happening, because we've all been a bit down on the Blackcaps, but they did find a way to step up when it mattered most. And there were a few moments in this test where I thought, like, this is nut crunching time. Like, Kane Williamson comes out to bat. They've been forced to follow on. Like, this is how your test career can be defined, as moments like this. Where do you crumble? Do you stand up and be accounted for? And the Blackcaps did that. I'm pretty chuffed with the Blackcaps effort. But to get into some analysis, because I'm sure we could talk around all the fluff and the everything else around the Blackcaps test team, but to get into the analysis, I actually thought the thing a lot of people who have been complaining about the Blackcaps, that worked in their favor here, because the Blackcaps team is too old. There's not enough young players in the Blackcaps. They're all over 30 years old, and it's terrible. But that's why the Blackcaps won this test. Is because Neil Wagner knows how to stay engaged in a contest. New Zealand needed Neil Wagner firing on all cylinders on the fifth day after he's already done so much mahi throughout the test and the test series. He had to keep showing up. The batters, they had to keep showing up, even though they've been rolled like 3 innings in a row. They're forced to follow on. You need reliable, trustworthy characters in those situations. Blokes who have played a lot of cricket, who have the experience to match the skill. And I kind of think the Blackcaps won this test thanks to that maturity and thanks to that reliability in a lot of their cricketers. And if you insert young players into that team, I'm not sure you get the same result.
Probably not. Particularly because you look at who stood up in particular, and it's Neil Wagner with the ball, it's Kane Williamson with the bat. Like, the two guys who have done this so many times before. Like, this is not the first time the Blackcaps have bowled a team out on day 5 to win, in particular, a home test match over their sort of, I don't know, the recent years when they've been quite a good team. This has happened a few times. I remember them doing it to Pakistan in the last session. I'm sure I'm trying to flick through. I think things in my head, and I can't remember exactly which team each was. But I know this has happened at least 3 or 4 times in the last 5 to 8 years that the Blackcaps have been in a situation like this, and that just it does make all the difference. Knowing that's one thing I was quite, I guess, proud of watching the team perform on that final day, but not just proud. It's like I had faith in them in a funny way. Like once they got a couple wickets early on, I thought, okay, well they're in the game. Like England might just be better than them and chase down the runs. But one thing I know about this Blackcaps team is that they are not going to lose their heads in this situation. They're not going to be the team that panics. Like they might get beaten just because the other team plays better cricket, but they're not going to throw it away themselves. The strength of their team over over their sort of strong span of this last, not quite a decade, but whatever that sort of 5 to 8 year range again. The strength of the team has been their bowling lineup in there. And okay, we didn't have Trent Boult, which would have helped. We didn't have Kyle Jamieson either, which would have helped. But what we did have was still Neil Wagner, Tim Southee, Matt Henry doing very good things throughout that, like just not bowling too many loose ones. Can't quite say the same thing about Michael Bracewell, who Joe Root absolutely went after for a while there, which wasn't pretty. But so it goes. That's Blackcaps spinner yarns. Said enough about that in the over going back years, frankly. But those seam bowlers, they know exactly how many runs they have to work with. They know exactly when to put the pinch on. They know they just know that they know that the game's never over until the last run is hit. And therefore, you just keep going in, steaming into the crease, hitting it as hard as possible. If you're Neil Wagner, you're also trying to hit the pitch as hard as possible, getting that ball up around minimum armpit height. Like they just don't give up. Like they know how to eke out every last bit of possibility in a game like that. And it was a wild fourth innings because it went back and forth so many times. There was a time where it thought, okay, we might bowl them out for 150 and win it quite easily. And then it was like, no, wait, Ben Stokes and especially Joe Root, world-class players, they're going to win by 5 wickets. And then all of a sudden, nope, okay, guess we're going to get this through. And then Ben Foakes comes in and does some wild things. And I was reminded listening to the English radio commentary that Ben Foakes and Joe Root, I think it was, can't remember if it was the first or second test, but it was one of the first 2 tests when we went over there last time and lost 3-0. But all 3 of those games were England chasing down really impressive fourth innings batting efforts. Like there was one of those games where Foakes and Root had a big partnership to see them through. And it was sort of like, here's your wicketkeeper. He's not the same as all these other dudes. I think like Mike Hatherton or someone on the radio before last test referred to him as the sober driver of the England batting lineup, which is quite funny. He's the one dude who bats normally. Everyone else goes out and tries to hit the ball hard. But Foakes was in a position where he was having to hit boundaries and whatever, and he was working it quite nicely. I think probably turned down a couple too many singles, and considering they still had a wicket, like 2 wickets to go, but. And also that those singles came in quite handy at the end where they weren't taking those Jack Leach runs. But still, then it swings back because Foakes gets out, and then Anderson and Leach have got to do it. And you think, okay, well, but then Anderson hits a 4, and then it's back the other favor. But the fact is, the Blackcaps throughout that just did what they had to do. Right. And as I said, like it might have been that England got through because they paced it slightly better or they're just a little bit better on the day, but it was never going to be because the Blackcaps faltered or lost their heads or panicked or freaked out and made weird tactical decisions or took big risks where it's like, okay, the whole game is going to be decided in this over. It's 20 runs to go, but we're going to go all out. And this is where it get like, Ben Stokes did that a little bit because he saw Neil Wagner coming back on and decided to tee off, and it got himself out because he couldn't swivel on his bad knee. But the Blackcaps were never going to do that. They were going to just give it 100% up until the final delivery, and that final delivery ended up winning them the Test match. Like it's perfectly measured cricket from the Blackcaps, and that's the strength of what they've been so good at. And they did it because they've been in this situation before. Dudes like Neil Wagner especially, and also Tim Southee as captain, I thought handled that really well too. Like And Matt Henry bowling through a sore back and still not throwing out the loose ones. Like, that's how you win a test match, bowling a team out in a very competitive total, and they did it. You know, it's just good cricket.
Certainly not here saying the Blackcaps are going to storm their way up the World Test Championship ladder or anything like that, although they should be able to defeat Sri Lanka in 2 home tests over the next week or so, which would take them a little bit up the World Test Championship ladder. But there has been a drop off with this test team, but there has also been, like, if you take out the England stuff, they went to Pakistan and drew a test series in Pakistan. And now I think this is Southee's first test win. So shout out to him.
Yeah, it must be. Yeah.
But I think a lot of Kiwis don't necessarily appreciate how difficult it is to get a positive result in a country like Pakistan. Like, Australia have gone to India and just been rolled. So maybe a drawn test series in Pakistan isn't that bad, and I think the Kiwis showed a bit of resolve, a bit of mana. But then you return to New Zealand and you lose the test against England at the Bay Oval, and it's like all these England ideas come back, and England have smoked the Blackcaps 4 tests in a row. But now there's you're just getting a little bit more of that mana, a little bit more of that resolve to not just to come out with a positive result and ensure that your team is in the best position. So I do think, bigger picture, yes, the Blackcaps are a little bit more fragile in New Zealand, but there is that seed, there is that fundamental element of Blackcaps Test cricket where it's still a good team, they're still tough to beat, and I'm curious to see what happens now, because if they defeat Sri Lanka in 2 tests to finish the summer, it's a bit of a different flavour to the summer of Test cricket.
Well, that's always been the case with the Blackcaps, isn't it? Where the reaction to them fluctuates between what they've done in the most recent series. There's not nearly enough of the old zoom out for a second and see the bigger picture aspect with the Blackcaps, particularly because the pattern used to be win at home, lose away. So they'd win at home and everyone thinks they're amazing, and therefore they go away and it's like, oh, well, they've been winning all these home games, so they're going to win all these away games too. And then they lose those. And, oh, they're terrible. They suck. This is terrible. We got to change the captain, change the coach. And then they come back home and win a bunch more games against Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, usually, maybe a bit of Pakistan. And then it's, oh, they're fantastic again. It's always been something in between. We know they were a little bit fortunate to qualify for the World Test Championship final, as well as they played in deserving to win the final itself. A little bit fortunate to get to it. And they've had a lot of misfortune in their defense. There's been stuff that they haven't helped themselves with, but there's also been retirements and unavailabilities, injuries and stuff like that, and also just I think a tougher draw. Having to go to India at one point, having to go to Australia at one point, 2 hardest places in the world to travel, particularly for a Blackcaps team, just traditionally speaking. So but then even after the Bay Oval test, I keep seeing things from people being like, well, I guess we're back to the early 2000s now where the Blackcaps suck. We're just going to have 10 years of rebuilding. It's not going to be the same. I'm thinking, we've still got Kane Williamson. What are you talking about? We've got one of the greatest batters ever who's still scoring good runs. And this idea that he's woefully out of form. He was actually on pace for his worst ever series after he got out for 3 single-digit figures in a row, first 3 innings of this series against England. I think he was averaging 3.3 and he had 10 runs combined. First time in his entire test career he's been out for single digits 3 times in a row. What does he do next? Match-winning century. That's Kane Williamson. You write him off at your peril, and you say the exact same thing about Neil Wagner, who got absolutely tonked at Bay Oval. And then I almost wonder with Wagner whether it's you fight fire with fire against him, that you're going to do all right, because he's not overly quick. He's deadly accurate with his bounces, but if you can handle that dead accuracy by hooking him for 6 over and over and over, as a few of those English dudes did, you kind of do take the bite out of him at that stage. But then what happened in the 4th innings was England had nerves. They weren't their flawless confidence, everything. We back ourselves entirely. They had nerves because they could see a difficult, target being set. Difficult run chase was in the midst. And Wagner just kept his consistent thing, just kept doing the same thing over and over and over at his high level, his deadly accurate level, and then a little bit of fragility in the England team all of a sudden it led to wickets. But it's also like write Neil Wagner off at your peril. I've said this a couple times in the last week, even though I was feeling like I can see what everyone else is saying. He just did not look himself at Bay Oval, and his pace is down. These things are true, but it's also like, he's got something else in him still. He's got the fire in the belly. So um, you've got that kind, and let alone like Tim Southee is extra motivated as the new captain and bowling as well as he ever has in his career over the last few years. Like a batting lineup with three dudes averaging over 50, a couple more in the sort of 40 range. When was that ever a bad team? They might not be as good as England overall, but that's not a bad team. That's a really, really good team. Just that there are maybe a couple weak spots now, a couple of vulnerabilities in the 11 which weren't there 2 or 3 years ago. We know this, we're dealing with that, but that doesn't suddenly make them complete rebuild, burn everything down, start from scratch. They're still going to be a good team who wins more games than they lose.
But also, like the Bay Oval pitch is not conducive with Neil Wagner bowling short at all.
So no, and I don't think the pink ball helped either.
You can't judge Neil Wagner based on the Bay Oval. And this is where like we need to educate ourselves over the pitches and the conditions in New Zealand, because there is a big difference between Bay Oval and the Basin Reserve. Things are going to be even like Basin Reserve and Hagley are a bit more similar, but they're also different. So did we like 3 bullies on the Bay Oval pitch? No. Yeah. Did Neil Wagner not bowl so well on the Bay Oval pitch? Yeah. Did the Basin Reserve suit Neil Wagner more as a traditional Kiwi deck? Yes, and it worked. So let's keep it moving. I am interested because we do have Plunket Shield happening at the moment. And I just want to use Plunket Shield to lay out some of the depth in Kiwi cricket. Because, like the idea the Blackcaps need to have young players is ridiculous. Like the Blackcaps test team is not a development exercise. The Blackcaps shouldn't be a development exercise for starters. Like that's for domestic cricket, that's for A tours. That's why you have that stuff to develop players. But even in the Blackcaps system, we've talked about this before, T20 internationals are the development areas. That's where you develop players. Henry Shipley, Ben Lister, you're going to India to play T20 internationals for your development, because we do have young players. And you need to get experience. The test team is there to win tests. The test team is there to sell tickets and represent Aotearoa in the best format of cricket. That's what they do. But the test team is not there to develop players. Because we've seen many young players struggle to be developed in test cricket. Like that is also a flaw of putting young players in the test team. But like there are players who can play in the test team coming up. Like the batting situation is clearly defined. Henry Nicholls is struggling for form. I think the next test team you'll see will either be Will Young and Henry Nicholls or Will Young ahead of Henry Nicholls. Either way, they have there is a order there. Henry Nicholls, Will Young, then Glenn Phillips, and maybe Rachin Ravindra's next. That's some encouraging future depth on display. Rachin Ravindra and Dean Foxcroft are hitting centuries in the Plunket Shield this weekend, or the last week. You look at the seam bowling ranks, again, you kind of want reliable players to call upon. And I think that's why they went with Blair Tickner and Scott Kugelheim as the bowling bullies at that Bay Oval test, because they were viewed as the most reliable players to do that job. Regardless of how we feel about it, I think that was the method. Well, Jacob Duffy's leading all wicket takers in the Plunket Shield, and Doug Bracewell's third. So they are probably the next bowlers in line, so you're not necessarily going to see youngsters promoted to those fringe spots, because you need to be better than Doug Bracewell. You need to be better than Jacob Duffy. And Jacob Duffy just took another fourther in the Plunkett Shield. So there is some younger players on the rise, let alone even younger, like Reese Mariu scored back-to-back 50s on Plunkett Shield debut for Canterbury. Always talking about Willow Rourke, Zach Folks for Canterbury as well. Northern Districts have Christian Clark, who is a fabulous all-rounder. Like, there's a lot of young talent around Aotearoa. Finn Allen didn't score any runs for Wellington. But I'll tell you who did. Muhammad Abbas. Making his Plunkett Shield debut, and he banged 8 boundaries and 4 sixes. Also bowls a bit of seam. Like, there's definitely a lot of fantastic young talent in Aotearoa, and they will help the Blackcaps in the future. But apart from, well, even Glenn Phillips, like, he's experienced. He is a bit younger, but he is experienced. Apart from those next batters, Rachin Ravindra and Glenn Phillips, I don't really see any space for a youngster to be developed in that test group. I don't think that's required, but I also don't see any youngsters really commanding that opportunity. Because Finn Allen doesn't score Plunkett Shield runs, so you're not going to put him in. Ben Sears is the fastest bowler in New Zealand, or one of. He's not playing. Lockie Ferguson doesn't play long-form cricket. Like, so you kind of need to pick your spots with some of these younger players and what they're good at, but there is young talent who will step into the test team in the coming years, and they are performing in the Plunkett Shield, so check in with the Plunkett Shield. But the Blackcaps to win, you need those reliable, trustworthy performers, of which I think Neil Wagner is the epitome. He's the epitome of that player.
I think the sort of friskiness that people have about the Blackcaps having an older team comes down mostly to this idea of, like, but what happens when they all retire at once? And I think that's a reductive idea, because like, they don't all retire at once, because there's a big gap in age between who's just turned 30 in that team, like Will Young, and the oldest would probably be Neil Wagner, I guess. There's like a 6-year gap between those two. Their careers aren't going to stop at, like, I mean, if anything, Will Young's at the start of his test career anyway at that age, and Neil Wagner is going to play as long as he wants. He's earned that. Just as Trent Bolt played as long as he wanted to some extent, and made a decision and edged himself a little bit onto the outer there. But I mean, Watling, Taylor, de Gronholm have all retired recently. Bolt effectively being considered in the same thing. They're going through that now. And what's happening is that they've got guys around that 28, 29, 30, 31, 32 age who are stepping into the team, who have been around the team for several years. In most cases, guys like Tickner and Young and fellas like that, who are filling those gaps. And maybe they're not going to be good enough, but they are the guys. Just because they're not good enough doesn't mean they're the best. They're not the best options. There are one or two examples, I think we could say, that they haven't necessarily picked the best dude, but it has been consistent with their ways of doing things. And whether we agree with that or not, it's not just happening at random. They're not just sticking their head in the sand. You know, they are working to a strategy that has worked for them in the past. And it has been the case with this Blackcaps test team that they're built around their best players, the same way every test team is built around their best players, and not everyone has 11 players who, like, a perfect example. Not everyone has a perfect player for every spot in the lineup. England seem to at the moment, but that's why they're really good at the moment. India's pretty much do. India's got 2 players for every spot, and they're also really good. Australia is sort of in between, depending on whether they're playing in Australia or whether they're playing in India at the moment, by the looks of it. But I mean, the Blackcaps have a settled, stable team. Like, that's not a bad thing. And also, dudes who are 30, you're not on the fringe of retirement. As I was saying, Will Young's at the start of his test career, effectively. These are dudes coming into their peak. These are not dudes coming out of their peak.
Same thing, Tom Blundell. closer to the start of his Test career than the end. Like Daryl Mitchell, closer to the start than the end. Like they're young in their Test careers, but not necessarily. Well, they're still young in age. Just interestingly, like players who have scored 2 centuries in the Plunkett Shield: Tom Latham, Tom Blundell, Rachin Ravindra, Cole McConchie. Shout out Cole McConchie, leading run scorer in the Plunkett Shield, only player to score over 500 runs. So he might, he's again, but Cole McConchie, Tom Bruce, Hamish Rutherford, those dudes are also old and experienced. So your backup batters for the Blackcaps Test team, they're not necessarily getting younger, but it's about performance. It's can they perform? Who are you relying on to perform and do that job? So we will dive into more Blackcaps cricket next week. Patreon podcast previewing the Test series against Sri Lanka. We also have a HBJ Shield final, the New Zealand Women's One-Day Final. That is happening on Saturday in Queenstown. Wellington Blaze versus Canterbury. I'll be whipping up a preview for that one tomorrow, so stay tuned. I am interested to see how many White Ferns are playing, because we know Wellington, they love the old White Fern. I don't think we'll see Sophie Devine, given that she just seems to be injured, so probably not best for her to be playing. But I think some of these White Ferns will want to get back into cricket after that T20 World Cup, or they might be on holiday. That's all good. But I am thinking like some of these White Ferns will play. Canterbury might get Leah Tahuhu back. Amy Satterthwaite should be playing in her last game of domestic cricket. And that would be epic, because she might farewell domestic cricket with an HBJ Shield Championship as well as a Super Smash Championship, because Canterbury defeated Wellington in the Super Smash final. As we know, Canterbury have one of the best female players in Kate Anderson, one of the best young seamers, Gabby Sullivan, other great players like Missy Banks, Sarah Asmussen, mentioned Satterthwaite, and Wellington. Just one of the best women's domestic programs in Aotearoa. Might have the Kerr sisters, Maddie Green, Rebecca Burns is one to watch, considering I reckon she should have been in that T20 World Cup team. But stay tuned. We will do lots of coverage about that HBJ Shield final. Preview yarn coming up, and I will recap it in the email newsletter on Monday as well. Repeat of the Super Smash final, so it's good to see those teams rocking at the top of the women's cricketing ranks. The Breakers start the NBL finals Friday night against Sydney Kings. They are Sydney Kings, defending champion Sydney Kings.
That's the one. And what do you call it? Leaders of the round robin as well, finished first, top seeded team.
Let's round it up and say the Big Donny Kings. They are the Big Donnies of the NBL, and the Breakers are the plucky underdog from last to competing in the finals. That was the basis of your kind of Breakers check-in, was how they went from last to not first, but in the finals. Did you have any takeaways from that just to help set up the finals?
Well, only in that, like, looking at a lot of the stats where it's like, how did they just look the evidence of them recovering from last to second on the ladder in one fell swoop, from last to making the NBL finals, and seeing things along the way of like, well, how they do this. Look at their defensive stats, their defensive ratings, and their opposition field goal percentages and 3-point percentages and things like this. It's like they've pretty much gone from last to first in all those categories, but not all of the offensive ones, where it's sort of like last to fourth or fifth sort of thing in a lot of those areas, which is fine, because who's going to be the best at both sides of the ball? Like, if you are, you're just by far the best team in the competition. If that's the case, you're the best scoring team and also the best defending team. You're the best team by a long margin if that's the case. With the Breakers, they don't have to be amazing on offense because they're so good defensively. they just have to be good enough, right? You only have to score more points than the opposition scores. So if your opposition only scores 80 points per game, you only got to score 81. If your opposition scores 90 points per game, you got to score 91. Like that's the difference. Um, but there were a few of those things, like net rating, I think was one of them, where it's like the Breakers are second best in the league because the Kings are still better than them. Like they've made this big rise up. They've overtaken all these teams that were destroying them last season, except for the Kings, because the Kings have been the best team throughout the season. Xavier Cooks is the best player in the league. Like they're they're really bloody good. And as good as the Breakers were, they finished second behind the Kings. Like the Kings are still the team to beat. And I think that makes this finals series quite exciting because I don't actually expect the Breakers to win. I think the Kings have to be the favorites. And if they're the favorites, then they should probably win. But if they play to their potential, I expect they will. They just got a little bit more in the tank than the Breakers do. And so it goes. If you're beaten by the better team, it's sort of similar yarns to some of that Test cricket stuff earlier. Like if you play well and you're beaten by the better team, there's no shame in that. And I think the Breakers have lived up to the potential they showed at the start of the season by seeing that through, finishing second, and then winning a semi-final series to take it to the grand final. It's almost freebie at this point. Like absolutely everything is on the line because there's a title there to be won. There's a championship within their grasp. But if they don't win it, no one's going to be like, what a failure, what a tragedy. They've choked this thing away. I mean, the manner of losing might yet define that, but as far as just being the second best team and making the final, they've reached the point, like they've reached the achievement for the season, which lives up to all the potential they showed in the first few months. Like they've done that. There's nothing to lose from this point onwards, and there's everything to gain. That's quite an exciting place to be in heading into a final, especially knowing that like it's not like the Kings thrashed them every opportunity this season. The Breakers had a little wobble for a while there when Barry Brown Jr. was injured, and they lost a couple games, and they were before that looking like they might finish first. Just that little form drop, and amidst a time where they were playing a lot of catch-up games because they'd had a couple of COVID postponements as well. It was tough. They were playing like Thursday, Sunday, and things got a little bit frisky for there. And then they came out of that by beating the Sydney Kings in Sydney, won their last 5 games in a row off the back of that, Kings win. They've beaten them and they've beaten them away. Like they know they can compete with this team. They know they can beat them if they play as well as they can. It's an exciting setup for an NBL final series. It really is.
They play in Sydney on Friday night and then back in Aotearoa on Sunday evening. They could be 1-1 just based on home and away over the weekend. At some point, they will need to win in Sydney to win the championship. So let's just focus on this first away trip to Sydney tomorrow night, Friday night. Is it like their defensive grit, the identity, the hard mahi culture, rebounding, gritty play? Does that all translate to getting a win in Sydney? Is that what you kind of noted in your research, just looking back on how they defeated Sydney in Sydney?
I think so. I think that Sydney dropped a couple games themselves towards the latter stage, and that was one of them. And I think maybe there was a little bit of like cruising to the finish line, focuses on the step beyond in the finals themselves, kind of thing with them. So I don't necessarily know that game tactically is the blueprint or anything like that. I think that for the Breakers to win, they just have to do what they do best, which is because that's always how the Breakers win. Like there've been a couple instances earlier on in the season where they did blow teams out because everything clicked offensively. But even then, it generally sprung off the back of good defense. So I think, for them to be able to get something off the Kings, and I do think game 1 is massive because if you look at the thing, it's like, I think it is, again, it's that sort of like, I think like Friday, Sunday. Like that sort of thing. So if you notice that, because it alternates home versus away, or away versus home in this case, if you notice that their 2 home games are both going to be on a short turnaround. whereas there's a longer turnaround for the two Sydney Kings games. And I don't mind that from a scheduling perspective because the advantage goes to the team that finished higher on the ladder. So they've earned that in a way. It might be a little bit of a stretch. It is quite tough on the Breakers because it's maybe more of a stretch than it needed to be with the scheduling there, but it is a factor, and it is a factor that at least you can say was earned by the Kings, even if it's a little bit maybe excessive still. Um, but that changes entirely if they win the first game. If you win the first game, you're running on momentum in that second home game, and also the Kings are on a short turnaround too, going away. Like you flip the home court advantage in that case. It's if you win away from home, you flip it. So getting off to the best possible start in this, and it's a 5-game final series as well, is massive. And I think, yeah, for the Breakers, it all just stems from containing Sydney, frustrating Sydney, and then doing just enough with their quite efficient but not spectacular offense to put them under pressure. And at that stage, you know you're going to get a close game. And when you got a close game, you just got to back your best players to see it through in the so-called the clutch moments, you know. And Barry Brown Jr. did that to absolute perfection in game 3 of the semis against Tasmania. So you just back your dudes to do the same thing in the finals. Basically, the way that they got there is the way they can go further. Like if they're going to win it, they win it by the same way they won games throughout the whole season to get to this point. You don't have to change anything because the formula works.
And there is a nice comparison between Sydney and the Breakers. The Breakers, I like off the top of my head, just based off purely of just like vague recollections. The Breakers, Sydney, and maybe Perth are the big Donnies of the NBL over the course of the last 20 years. Like they seem to be the teams that win the most.
Breakers and Perth for quite a while there, and then more recently it's sort of been Melbourne United and Sydney. So yeah, over the last decade, those are the 4 teams who have been doing the business.
But throughout that, Sydney have felt like the Sydney Roosters equivalent of the NBL. Like they are maybe
the richest team, they get the calls, those kind of reputations.
Most
it's probably only in the last 3 or 4 years for them, but it definitely is the case now.
And so you've got that angle where it's like the Breakers built on Kiwi fundamentals. They're probably going to try grind out wins. They're probably going to try get under the skin of Sydney. Physical, D Pardon, D Brantley, B Brown. I was, couldn't get the D Brown in there, but Barry Brown, or Tommy V. He might have something to say. Like it seems like there is a possibility for the Breakers to really embrace the niggle and come in with that kind of energy, especially for these away trips against Sydney. Because if you win this first game away, you come back to Aotearoa and they love the local crowd there for the Breakers at Spark Arena. Could be 2-0 up. Anything can happen from there. Like that would be ideal. And I think it just starts with the Breakers really embracing everything that has worked for them so far, as you said, for an away trip against Sydney. Because obviously this might not be the best comparison, but it's not an away trip to Perth for sure, the distance derby, but I mean that because like when the Breakers face Perth, it's like both teams are gritty, both teams are niggly, both teams are rugged and ruthless. Whereas this one feels like the Breakers are coming up against the flashy, wealthiest team, the Sydney Kings. And I'm curious to see how that looks for the first game, because if the Breakers embrace everything they've done to this point, I think it could really be interesting.
First game as well, you don't have the short turnaround for the first game. You've got time to prepare for it too. So
it's been over a week.
Ready to roll. Yeah. They've had time to settle.
Oh, Mika Vakona could lace up with that kind of layoff. Let's just drop a couple. Let's drop it like it's hot for the NRL. We have Warriors taking on the Knights, and my first point in the NRL conversation is the Warriors taking on the Knights. All 3 Warriors teams are playing against the Knights, and I don't have the Knights in the same kind of Broncos, Bulldogs, Warriors mixer, my cauldron of NRL comparison. But the Knights are an interesting team to gauge the Warriors against. But all three teams are playing against the Knights, which will be really interesting. Hopefully the Warriors can win all three games and the Knights kind of suck. One thing I do, so a couple notes on the Warriors. Mitch Barnett coming up against his former team, starting at prop against the Saifidi twins. Everyone loves the Saifidi twins. Not sure how everyone doesn't love Barnett, Fanua Blake, and Tohu Harris, but we'll see how that rolls out because obviously the Warriors forward pack needs to be good for the Warriors to make finals. The other thing I do want to highlight is I've had that Brown Ponga comparison, which I think is great because I love Dylan Brown, fantastic footballer. But maybe a better comparison is Tamara Martin, because Tamara Martin actually played fullback for the Broncos. And now they're both starting number 6 in this game. And personally, I might think that Tamara Martin's a better number 6 than Kalen Ponga, because I've already planted that seed with Dylan Brown. But we know Kalen Ponga might be a defensive liability if he's defending in the line. And we also know Maratini Okore, who I'm just calling the Mangere Mountain. We know Maratini Okore is an absolute beast. And if Kalen Ponga has to tackle Maratini Okore on that right edge a lot, because I think Jackson Ford's probably going to be left edge, Maratini Okore is probably going to be right edge. It's going to be tough for Kalen Ponga to stop Maratini Okore. And if the Warriors can throw some shape at him as well, it will complicate Ponga's defensive read. So I am interested to see how this game goes. Wrote about it, so you can go check that out if you do want a deeper dive. The other thing, and this ties into what we're talking about, the Blackcaps. We've talked about it with the White Ferns. We've talked about it with the Football Ferns. Maybe even the All Whites, because the All Whites have had a lot of the younger players in their team recently, which, whether we like it or not, impacts results. The Warriors, I don't see any young players in their top 17. Outside the top 17, you got Viliami Vailea, Ronald Volkman, Tain Tuaupiki, Edward Kosi, Freddie Lussick. Like, all those guys are a bit younger. They are the depth players. But the Warriors are starting this season with Adam Pompey as your youngest player in the starting lineup. And then you've got Tom Ale off the bench. Tom Ale just has to do a real simple role. So I'm not like, it's not he can't really impact games other than storming through defensive lines. But usually when I check in with the Warriors in round 1, there's a couple youngsters in the team list. And I've definitely learned across all these Kiwi sports that to win, you need your reliable characters. You need your Neil Wagners. You need your Tommy Lathams, reliable Tommy Blundell, those type of characters. I think the Warriors have that. And I'm not looking at like these young holes where like you might start a season with Viliami Vailea and Rocco Berry as your centre pairing. And it's like, well, you need to sit with those guys in the NRL for a few weeks. You need to let them develop to get their best footy out of them. No one needs to develop in this, starting lineup that the Warriors have named. Even on the bench, Dylan Walker, Bunty Afoa, Josh Curran, they've played a lot of NRL footy. And this goes into the signings that the Warriors made. Shans Nickel-Klokstad, Tamara Martin, Braden Williami, Mitch Barnett, Jackson Ford, Dylan Walker, Maratini Okore, like all those dudes are solid NRL professionals. So I'm seeing targeted recruitment for those type of players. And now I'm seeing a team consisting of those type of players, which I think is interesting. And for the Warriors to win games of footy, you want as few young players as possible to get the job done. Unless those young players are the young phenoms, as we've talked about, the X-factor players, a Kyle Jamison who gets straight into the team. Those type of players will get an opportunity throughout the season, but you don't want to rely on them for the rigors of NRL footy every week because it's a tough competition and all these dudes will get injured and suspended, so young players will come in. But for the Warriors to make finals footy, you want as much experience and maturity on the park as often as possible. Any notes on that?
Well, I'd forgotten about the All Whites. Out of sight, out of mind. They are playing later this month against China, though, so there's definitely some interesting squad selections that will come out of that because you've got the interim coach. So it's like, how much do you want to use that as an excuse to maybe get some fresh players in, or whatever? But also, I think there's two under-23 games against China at the same time, which I'm low-key even more excited about because I want to see what that looks like. But yeah, the All Whites did go quite fresh, quite young under Danny Hay. They sort of needed to because it just got to where all their best players were of a certain age, and the previous generation was sort of on the outer. And it's like head to head, you're still picking the best players, and that's a core of the All Whites team that's going to be really good for the next 10 years, hopefully. But I do think it cost them against Costa Rica. Like, I do think a more experienced team would have been able to turn their dominance into goals, into not conceding that silly one early on. And you compare it, it was the main the main theme of the previews stuff that I wrote about them was how the All Whites had this young team right at the very start of a new generation, and Costa Rica had this old team right at the very end of a golden generation, where a lot of them were from the team that made the quarterfinals in 2014 or 2018, I can't remember, but they've been to several World Cups together already, and they just knew how to win a one-off game. And it wasn't pretty, it wasn't flash, but they did it, and they're great leaders across the field. Hilariously, Kayla Navas and Chris Wood are now teammates at Nottingham Forest, which is never would have possibly imagined that at the time. There you go. Football's a little bit crazy like that. But on the Warriors, I think I'm right. I count 6 new signings in the run on 13 and then another one on the bench. Is that right? Viliami, Martin, Ford Niokore, Barnett, Nickel Klokstad as well, and then Walker on the bench. I think that's it. That seems like a lot, doesn't it? Like you've got a new coach in as well, so I guess it's a fresh start, but that does seem like a lot. Are there any surprises in that team that was named? Like, there are things that sort of caught you off guard, or was it all just kind of as telegraphed through the preseason?
Yeah, not really. Like, that's the turnover the Warriors have had. Like,
yeah,
bunch of players left. You got to sign a bunch of players. Like, it's how it is. What it is. But like the Braden Williami at center, that is what I'm saying. Like, Andrew Webster must trust Braden Williami to do a job at center because the alternative is a younger player. Like, yeah, Pompey is generally the same age as Vilea or even the Rocco Berry, who's not in the squad, but I think he's out injured. But Pompey has played a lot of footy, and he must have done something to impress Webster. So I think a lot of those selections, Williami at centre, Montoya on the wing, Jackson Ford as an edge forward, they are there because they are Neil Wagner's. They are reliable. They are like the coach, whether I trust them or not, the coach must trust them to do a job ahead of a youngster, and the youngsters will get an opportunity. But the fact that you're starting with just some solid NRL pros, I think, is a good sign. Second note for the NRL is the game tonight, Storm versus Eels. William Warbrick, debut for the Storm. Massive yarn.
Hey.
Everyone needs to know about Will Warbrick. You will hear the story about him playing sevens, but you also need to learn about his whānau, some of his ancestors who basically started professional, not professional, but they toured England and Australia to play rugby league, rugby union, and AFL. And you need to, I think there's a little documentary on YouTube. You can go on Wikipedia, search the Warbrick whānau. They are the epitome of rugby royalty in New Zealand. No one is more important than the Warbrick whānau. So you need to tap in, and old William Warbrick is making his debut for the Storm against the Eels. The Eels, they got Jira Momosia on their bench. They got Wiremu Greg on their bench. They got Makahisi Makatoa on their bench. Unfortunately, Ofahiki Ogden drops out. But that's the most interesting crop for the Eels, because they lost Isaiah Papali'i, they lost Marata Niokore, and they have been replaced by Jerome Momasia and Wiramu Greg. Makatoa's fantastic. I love Makatoa. He was there for much of last season. Dropped out of their top 17 for the finals. What do you know? Eels didn't win the championship, and that's why. But that pocket on the Eels bench is really interesting. I'm also fascinated by the rise of Keanu Kinney at the Gold Coast Titans. He is a Northcote / Marist Jr. from Auckland. There was something I searched. If I just where he might have spent his younger years in Marlborough, because I did see something about a primary school. Yeah, pupils win breakfast with league stars. This is from 2009, and you got a Keanu Kinney photographed with Ruben Wiki at Marlborough Primary School. So I think he must have moved up to Auckland at some point after that. Northcote Junior, Marist Junior as well. Then he went over to the Gold Coast, entered their system. He's been tearing it up in all the age group footy. And he's on the bench already for the Titans, which is really impressive. Livewire, one of like the Titans released Paul Turner to go to the Dragons, your Dragons. And that's basically because the Titans have far too many young livewires in their squad. One of which is Keanu Kinney. And I think he might play NRL footy pretty soon. So keep an eye on him, because another fantastic talent out of Aotearoa. And the other point of intrigue, like these are all quite obscure notes because all the big donnies around, we know who they are, we know how they play. But I'm also interested in Nofahu White with the Roosters because he has kept his spot on their bench. And he was from Kelston. I think he was like a Bay Roskill junior. And the Roosters specifically recruited him out of Kelston Boys High School. He was playing first 15 for them and went straight over to the Roosters after finishing school. Didn't quite kick on last season. He was one of these players who made their NRL debut and then dropped down a level last year. He did play the odd New South Wales Cup game, but he wasn't a consistent presence in New South Wales Cup, let alone NRL. Now he's on the bench, and he's specifically on the bench ahead of Siwa Wong. So Siwa Wong's one of the hottest NRL prospects on the rise from Aotearoa, from Auckland as well, went to Mount Albert Grammar. But he's on the extended bench, and Nofahu White is keeping that spot on the bench as a very robust middle forward. Again, like Leo Thompson for the Knights, who you're going to see play against the Warriors, midfielders in first 15 rugby, middle forwards in NRL. I love that. Just shows you a lot about the power and skill. Also, something that we've seen Dimitri Sifakula do. He was a midfielder for De La Salle College first 15. Now he is starting as a lock forward for the Warriors New South Wales Cup team. So I'll come back with a bunch of notes on the Patreon podcast for the Kiwi-NRL Spotlight on Monday. Do have that Warriors yarn breaking down SG Ball and New South Wales Cup as well. Might include some Kiwi-NRL notes for our Friday email newsletter. Anything to respond there?
Yeah, just one thing. Well, I was just looking at the draw to see when the Dragons play, and they don't, because of course it's another team in the NRL this season, which means there's 17 teams, which means it's uneven, which means that there's a bye round for one team every week. Dragons have it in week 1, and they also play the round 2. They play the Titans, but it's the last game of the round. So all but the Titans themselves and whoever has a bye next week, like 15 of the teams, 14 of the teams, because the Dragons are one of them, will have played twice before the Dragons played their first game. So that's a weird anomaly of the rule. But I did want to ask, because obviously the old Redcliffe Dolphins are the expansion side, and it was a little bit of a narrative last season how they were trying to build out their team, seemingly by signing a decent core of Kiwi dudes. How's that looking for round 1, like their first actual NRL game? since getting in there. Is it sort of Kiwis B side set up? Like, how's that gone for the old It's Wayne Bennett, isn't it, coaching them? How's Uncle Wayne gone with his Kiwi lads?
First and foremost, I think we're all just pretending like the Dragons don't exist. So, like,
I think the NRL draw did as well too.
don't take it personally.
No, it's
But
probably a good thing.
I don't think anyone cares about the Dragons right now, considering what they're up to. Dolphins, what do they got? So we got 20 odd players here. We got Jermaine Usako, Isaiah Katoa. Regardless of what anyone in Australia says, like, he's from Wellington, right? He's probably going to represent Tonga throughout his career. He might even have moved to New South Wales because I think his older brother Sione Katoa left Wellington to enter the Panthers system, maybe, or it might have been the Roosters or something like that. So he moved to Sydney. So Isaiah might have moved to Sydney at a young age. So he might even play Origin from Wellington. So I'm counting him. So we got 2: Jesse Bromwich, Marshall King, Kenny Bromwich, Herman Esaese, Mangere East Jr., Connolly Lamelu, he's from Papatoetoe Rugby, Pawasa Fa'amasili, left your Dragons, he's a Glenora Jr. So you got 7 Kiwi NRL players in that squad of 22. So not quite half, but also what people need to know about the Redcliffe Dolphins, they've got Kiwi NRL juniors in their lower grades as well. So they've already been recruiting Kiwi NRL juniors. And not just like Taniela Otakulo from the Warriors. They might get the other Kepu twin who left the Warriors. Like, there's that obvious connection. Because old Peter O'Sullivan used to work for the Warriors. Now he's working for the Dolphins. So it's an obvious, let alone the Warriors-Redcliffe connection. But they are also recruiting, like any other NRL team, from Aotearoa in their junior ranks. Won't get into some of the names, but you can look at their Mal Meninga Cup, and you should be able to look at their Hastings Daring Colts team in a few weeks as well. They'll have 1 or 2 Kiwi NRL juniors in those teams as well. So the expansion team are establishing themselves with a Kiwi NRL presence straight out of the gate. Tells you all you need to know about Aotearoa Rugby League. It's finished with a bit of football. You got free reign here. You can go Phoenix. Is it a double banger on Sunday, Sky Stadium?
Yeah, I think it might be. Both home games. The men are playing Newcastle and the women are playing Brisbane, which, to be honest, that's got 6-pointer potential about that. They could, the women drew 3-3 away with Brisbane and were unlucky not to win that game a couple of weeks ago. The men, anytime they're at home, is a winnable game because they're really good, and Newcastle are below them on the ladder, so it's a game they should be expecting to get 3 points out of. The women can't expect to get 3 points out of any game, but it's certainly a game they can target for it. So, yeah, I think they're both at Sky Stadium. In which case, big Saturday afternoon, evening there coming up.
Warriors are playing in Wellington. Blackcaps are at the base in reserve. Big old Wellington times at the moment.
Good overlap too, because the Warriors are on Friday night, aren't they? At like 8 o'clock or whatever, and then the Breakers tip off at 9:30 because it's an away game, also on Friday night. So you might miss the first quarter of the Breakers, but you'll get to see most of that game. So there's a nice Friday evening set up there, and then there's a nice Saturday afternoon evening set up with the Phoenix doubleheader as well. And I'm sure there'll be some other stuff on. I mean, there'll be NRL games on after that as well. So banger of a weekend coming up.
More specifically, Wellington.
But yeah, more specifically, Wellington, stemming off of one of the greatest test matches of all time.
At New Zealand's greatest test venue of all time.
Of course, the Temple.
I don't know if the Cake Tin is part of that, but
no, it's not as prestigious, no, but it's what we've got,
Yeah. What else? So Phoenix, couple of wins there. Anything else your football? How are you feeling flying Kiwis, Wellington Phoenix? You seem real hot about the football Ferns at the moment. Like you're just unleashing football Ferns realism. So you might want to finish with a football Ferns.
That's more or less football Ferns realism is a good way to put it too, because it's one of those things where it's, and we've had this many times with things where it feels like the niche case is saying one thing and then everyone else is saying a different thing. But then there's also like a conviction that we have that's like, but the thing we're saying is objectively true, and everyone else is missing a point here. It's like, and that's what I've been trying to say with the football ferns. Like, I had to split my roundup of their last international window up into two pieces because I had to get the tactical stuff in its own thing so that I could first run through the contextual stuff about, I mean, I won't do it all here because I mentioned a lot of it on the variety show and I've written about it, obviously, but just things like they have keeping up with one of the themes of what we've been talked about with a few of these different teams on this podcast today. Like, if they have younger, more inexperienced players, it's harder to win. There will be more mistakes. There is a learning curve that comes with that. That's how you get experience. It's important, but it's not like they're being blooded in smoothly. There've been 8 retirements, 9 if you count Amber Hearn, who wasn't at the last World Cup, but only because she was injured with the injury that led to her retirement. There's 8 other players who've retired since the last World Cup. There's a new coach since the last World Cup. It's actually a new coach since the last Olympics in between. Like, that doesn't make it easy to win. It doesn't mean that they suck. It doesn't mean they're untalented. It might just mean that they're not quite there yet, you know? And you add in, more importantly than anything, I think, is the injuries they've been suffering. They've hardly had a first choice team in any of these games they've played recently. Every time a key player is missing, their chances of getting a positive result goes down a little bit. Vic Essen has been the starting goalkeeper in 5 of the 6 games where they've got a win or a draw under Klimkova. She didn't play any of the 3 games because she was injured. She didn't play again for Rangers this morning, so she's still injured a week and a half later. That, like, Erin Naylor's a good goalie. I like Erin Naylor, but she is the third choice these days. 2 other keepers have come through and just plain performed better. Elite more to do with their club stuff, but still, Vic Essen's got the club stuff and she's got performances for the Ferns that back this up, which is why she's the number 1. And good things have happened when she's played, and she didn't play these games. CJ Bott and Ali Riley didn't play after the first game. They didn't play the next couple. Liv Chance missed the third one. Rebecca Stott missed the whole tour. Like, Rhea Percival, probably the most important player they have, has been out long-term with injury. Hasn't played for quite a while. And what do you know? The team's got significantly worse when she hasn't been there. Well, at least results and performances a little. I don't know that it's tricky. Because of all these reasons I'm mentioning, it's tricky to evaluate them. But they have got worse results without Rhea Percival. And guess what? So have Tottenham Hotspur. When Rhea Percival was playing almost every minute for them last season, they went on to have she missed the last couple of games because of the injury that she's got. But leading up to that, she set them up to where they ended up with their best ever finish in a season, the Tottenham women's team. Best ever finish. They were like 5th, I think, in the WSL. This season, they're not in relegation trouble or anything, but they're down that sort of 7th or 8th rank, and it's considerably worse than what they were last year. They're not scoring many goals. They've had a couple of bad defenses. They're still a decent defensive team, but they've had a few bad days out in there. They're very clearly missing the work rate of Rhea Percival in midfield. It's not just the Ferns that this affects. It's actually every team ever in history. You don't have your best players, your chances to be successful go down, as well as just the fact that so much more money is going into women's football these days, and that money tends to go to the richest countries because that's where it comes from. Like, that's how it goes. The rich get richer is sort of a dirty secret of football in general. Like, the teams that win most of the trophies are the richest ones. It's kind of how it goes. And the countries that do the best are the ones with the biggest population and the most resources. We're having an underdog thing enforced a little bit more in a way that maybe we got away with it in the past. We got a little bit lucky. We got these free passes into tournaments because we're coming out of Oceania, and the contrast between that is difficult. And I don't understand why people don't see these very obvious reasons for the Ferns struggling and just say, oh, it's a lack of professionalism, or that the coach is terrible. They've got no idea what they're doing. The players are rubbish. They've got no technique. They can't handle it. It's like, they're not inexcusable. They've had some bad performances. The second half against Portugal was absolutely awful, but there are reasons for these things too. and it's not the reasons that people want to make snap judgments towards. So I just, sometimes you got to stand on a hill and shout this stuff out because it does need to be said. And every now and then we have one of these hills to stand on and shout. I remember having one with the Breakers a couple of years ago when they were down in the dumps, and that's in that occasion we got pushback from that, which was fun. nice exciting time there in the history of the niche cache. But we've had a few of these with the cricket teams as well. White Ferns is actually a good example of this. Sometimes I don't know. I almost feel when I'm writing those kind of things that it's kind of like what our website exists for, is to be able to give that alternative but very instructive point of view when it is being ignored by other people, because it's just a little bit easier to focus on the I don't know, the surface level emotional reaction.
Yeah, I said for like the White Ferns, the problem isn't domestic cricket in New Zealand, it's the White Ferns. And I think for the football Ferns, the problem isn't women's football in New Zealand, it's you. Not you per se, but the person who doesn't know anything about women's football talking shit about the football Ferns. Like, that is the problem.
Tuning in for the first time in a couple of years because there's a World Cup coming up, and which is awesome. Like, that's what we want, is those fans to be engaged and to just make everything more popular and more. If it's more popular, you get more money involved and whatever. It's how it grows, but also you can't just walk in without a background on the team and be an expert from day one, right? You can't just walk in and start calling the shots.
The problem isn't the football Ferns, it's you. There you go. Big up yourself, not you listening, because you listening are probably an educated Kiwi sports fan tuning in for the nuance, the nuggets, the wrinkles, the bits and bobs to help you build the picture, enjoy the vista. Big up yourself. Kia kaha, stay beautiful. Enjoy Aotearoa, enjoy the sport. Chit